calling this an alternative road or democratic intermezzo, as somebody called, because in the Bulgarian case, the bulk of the terror occurred immediately in these first years. Then the road to the full Sovietization, the tabula rasa, was created for the final Sovietization of the country. Thank you.
Final speaker is Dragos Petrescu. 20 minutes.
Mr. Chairman. So first of all, commentator, yes. First of all, I would also like to thank the organizers for giving me the chance to share my ideas with such a distinguished public. Now, my paper is not about Stalinization of Romania, but it's rather a very interesting event or process I found, that is the national, so-called nationalistic turn under the Gheorghiu-Dej regime. So I would like to first to summarize my argument in the form of 3 statements. First, looking retrospectively, it may be argued that the nation-building process in Romania took the form of a unitary project that had 3 main components. First, elite manipulation. Second, modernization conducted from above. And third, that is cultural reproduction. The second statement is the following. Contingency played a major role in the initiations of the mentioned nation-building process, and in this respect, under Gheorghiu-Dej, and in this respect, the year 1956 was a major, the turning point. And the third statement is the following. The initiation of the nation-building process I mentioned took the form of a selective community building and not of a overall, of all-encompassing nation-building process. So under Gheorghiu-Dej, the initiation of this nation-building process was a selective community building. Now, what happened afterwards, it's another story, but I think that under Ceausescu, this took the form of an all-encompassing nation-building. Now, as far as the conceptual framework I use is concerned, I was deeply influenced by Kenneth Jowitt's work as revolutionary breakthroughs and national development, especially with his distinction between system building and community building under communism as major parts of the nation-building process, but also by Vladimir Tismaneanu's approach, especially his 3 centers theory and the idea of looking thoroughly to the identity-forming experiences of the Romanian communist elite. Finally, I would say that in terms of sources, I was very much interested in the private and official versions of party history or the power struggle within the party. That is, I was interested especially by the private version by the communist nomenclatura, the memoirs, especially those who lived long enough to speak after the fall of communism in 1989, and also by the official documents, so the official statements under Gheorghiu-Dej. Now, final thing regarding the conceptual framework, I do believe that under Gheorghiu-Dej, the immediate political goals were contextually defined, and the strategies devised, the political strategies devised to pursue them were heavily context dependent. Now, as far as the nation-building process, I'm not going to address it at length, but I shall provide some elements. It is not quite clear now that actually the nation-building process in Romania did not come to an end in 1918 with the creation of Greater Romania. Now, Romanian historians usually tend to put the end of this process around 1918. Party historians under communism, like Ștefan Pascu, actually said that the process of nation building in Romania was completed somewhere between the revolution of 1848 and the creation of Greater Romania in 1918. Western scholars, especially Irina Livezeanu or Kenneth Jowitt, spoke of the frailty of the political project of Greater Romania, and also, as Kenneth Jowitt put it, and I'm quote, the elites and major sectors of the population lacked meaningful shared sentiments of community and a relatively consistent, jointly shaped set of commitments to the nation state itself. And as Irina Livezeanu, and I'm quote, said, The Union of 1918 brought into being a deeply fragmented polity, and the startling effects of centuries of political separation presented great challenges to the newly enlarged state and to the sense of national identity of its population. Also, I'm using here the conceptual framework put forward by Rogers Brubaker, who actually discussed the sense of the political elites in Greater Romania seeing the nation-state as still unrealized and continuously threatened by some of its neighbors, especially by neighboring Hungary and Soviet Union. This is my addition to this. Brubaker has argued that a widespread tendency to conceive one's own nation state as unrealized imposes the adoption of a dynamic political stance, since the state was perceived as not being yet national in its entirety. It was imperative to be nationalizing. But as far as the process of nation building, and I'm going to finish at this point with the first point regarding the process of nation building in the three components I have described. Yes, okay. First, I think that in the Romanian case, the process of turning peasants into Romanian, to paraphrase Eugene Weber, actually took a decisive course only in the late communism in the conditions of an extensive program of centrally planned urbanization and industrialization, increased communication, and the spread of education. A nation must, in my opinion, a nation can be defined as an organized solidarity as an imagined community. In other words, I'm perceiving the process of nation building as an organized solidarity, as a process initiated from above, and an imagined community somehow in a different reading of Benedict Anderson's famous book as a process from below, in the sense, in the framework of the nation state, of a centrally organized education system and increased communication. Now, nonetheless, a major difficulty is to identify the roots of the so-called nationalistic turn under Gheorghiu Dej, under the Stalinist regime of Gheorghiu Dej. Now, it is something that somewhere on the road to the party-state fusion, the nation came out. And it came out, surfaced in the mental structure of Dej socialism without being referred to as such. Ironically enough, the way the nation was understood by the end of Dej's rule reminded much of the way it was conceptualized in the interwar period. Although, if one looks attentively and reads the official documents, one never found the term nation. Gheorghiu Dej himself used motherland, people, and uses nation or national only in connection with national economy or national independence, or in the context of speaking of national liberation movements. Now, I'm moving to the second statement, that is the idea that 1956 was a major turning point and actually was the source of this nationalistic turn. But first of all, it is important to look at the way the challenges that stayed in the face of that group from prison, and that is Gheorghiu Dej and his men. In other words, it's important to understand that finally it was about a small group of prisons, those many of them ethnic Romanians, but not only, that actually was first faced with the problem of taking power within the party, that is in that process of party institutionalization, and then engaging in the community building. And what is even more important is that actually that group from prison, as we know from some witness accounts, especially for Pavel Câmpeanu, who was actually a member, a sociologist and a member of that group from prisons, they developed a very sharp distinction. It was about an intra-group perception and the vision of politics. And that group from prison made a very sharp distinction between in-group and out-group individuals. So the first thing to do was to take power within the party, and this was wonderfully described by Vladimir Tismaneanu, Stalinism for all seasons. It was a fierce power struggle. And finally, in 1952, the group from prison, that is Dej and his men, were finally successful. They took over the party, and their power was, I would say, unchallenged, although there were still problems. Nevertheless, this was the first step. It was party institutionalization. But then they had to engage in a sort of community building. Of course, those processes came together. it was not actually, but it was a preeminence of the party institutionalization, that is, formalization, infusion of values, emotional attachment. But after 52, after the purge of the so-called factionalist group of Ana Paucar, Teohari Georgescu, and Vasile Luca, it was another problem. It was to reshape the party and the infusion of new values, emotional attachment, and formalization. In this respect, I would say that first, the major problem was taking power, and they did. Now, there were also some historical accidents, and I'm going to talk about them. It was first 1953, it was the death of Stalin. Not everything changed, but in 1953, death of Stalin, but in 1956, something changed definitely. First, it was the secret speech of Nikita Khrushchev in the front of the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And that it was a problem for Dej and his men, because he was a Stalinist still in power, but Khrushchev spoke about de-Stalinization. So Dej and his men had to devise a strategy to avoid de-Stalinization. And also, something really important happened. It reinforced an old myth coming from the interwar period of illegality of the underground Romanian Communist Party, that is fear from Moscow, fear that Moscow would intervene and remove from power the Dej team. But also it was another important moment, that is 1956 and the Hungarian Revolution. And this, I think, is the crucial moment. Because not only that, in 1956, what happened in Hungary reinforced another major myth of the Romanian communists, that is distrust towards Budapest. Because they were, for a long period, were conducted by the Communist Party that was conducted from Moscow, but was led inside the country by non-ethnic Romanian leaders, many of Hungarian origin or perhaps Jewish origin. And in 56, it's interesting, Romanian Communist Party, Romanian Workers' Party at the time, sent a delegation to Budapest to witness what was happening there. And the 2nd of November 1956, that delegation, especially Walter Roman and Aurel Mălnășan, spoke in front of the Politburo. And Walter Roman put forward two major things. First, it was that the counter-revolution actually occurred in Hungary because the party was too subservient to Soviet Union, and also departed from the traditions of the Hungarian people. But also, that delegation told something very interesting about Romania, because Walter Roman said in front of the Politburo that Janos Kadar, whom he met in those days, said to him, give autonomy to Transylvania. And also in front of the Politburo, Walter Roman said that it was also a problem of the unprincipled position towards Transylvania by the Hungarian leaders. And now, I think that this is why in 56, I think two major important myths of the party, that is distrust from Budapest, but first fear of Moscow and distrust towards Budapest, re-emerged. In the aftermath of the 1956 revolution in Hungary, of course, the Romanian communists had to devise something, because the two events of 56 actually made them think that legitimacy cannot come anymore from Moscow. They had to return to the people. And now I am coming to the third point of my discussion, which is that selective community building process as an initiation of the all-encompassing nation-building process in communist Romania. Because it is something very interesting. The myth of the party were superposed to the two most cherished national historical myths of the Romanians. The Romanian Communist Party from the interwar period had two major myths. The first one was party monolithism, avoiding factionalism at all costs. But the second one was emancipation. Vladimir Tismaneanu spoke earlier about the pariah communism syndrome. It was a party that had to fight for self-assertiveness, a party that had to assert itself within the communist movement. It was a party that had made of emancipation a most cherished myth. But somehow, interestingly, when Dej decided to turn again towards the people, those two myths were superposed to other two important historical myths of the Romanian, that is, unity and independence. From the making or the creation of modern Romania in the mid-19th century, there were four major historical myths as founding myths of the Romanian nation. That is, unity, independence, continuity, and ancient roots. For the party, two of them were of utmost importance: unity and independence, because they were resonated from the identity-forming experience of within the group from prison vision of politics. That is what Dej and his men were thinking about their party, a party that needed monolithism and emancipation. It was about left to Ceausescu to add to those two most cherished myths of unity and independence other two, that is continuity and ancient roots of the Romanian, and somehow expanding the vision of party history at the national level. As far as Dej was concerned, now, there is a problem to what extent it was not about a chauvinistic, xenophobic idea of politics and ethnicity, or ethno-centered project about Dej. Now, Pavel Câmpeanu says that within the prisons, the group from prison did not have a xenophobic views. They did not take xenophobic stances. He said that actually it was not about class relations or ideology, but rather of relationship of personal dependence. Well, I'm not quite sure if Dej and his men, the ethnic Romanians from that group from prison, did not share some xenophobic views. Perhaps it's also a problem of interpreting the ousting of Anna Pauker also for her Jewishness, and also because he was a woman. But I think that as far as Anna Pauker was concerned, the main issue, it was that she was a redoubtable contender for power, and Dej saw in her especially a contender for power. It was also about Jewishness and gender, but only after this rivalry. Now, nevertheless, as I said, looking back to the sources, looking back to what Dej had to say about nation, it seemed that this was not exactly in his repertoire. It was also, again, this idea of sharing, of superposing the myth of party monolithism and emancipation with the myth of unity and independence. It was for Ceausescu to follow this and to extend them in an all-encompassing nation-building project. It would be really interesting to see how Ceausescu got to speak of the nation. Now, it's quite clear that you cannot engage in an all-encompassing nation-building project without having going towards deeper all straight of the society. And in this respect, having so many political prisoners up to 1964, it was not possible to reach the whole society. It was only after 1964 that this all-encompassing project could have been developed by Dej himself. We don't know. It's also interesting to look to the modernization from above, how Dej engaged in those mega projects that were meant to ensure the independence of Romania. First, the Galați Steelworks Combine, and also the Iron Gates hydroelectric power plant. The hydroelectric power plant was inaugurated by Dej and Tito, but the works at this power plant were inaugurated by Dej and Tito, but it was Ceausescu and Tito that put it at work when it was finished. Nevertheless, both projects were also meant to ensure independence. And in this respect, it's interesting that also modernization was put at work to some extent to serve one of the two major myths of the party, but also of the party polity or the party state, speaking in the Leninist terms. Now, it would be also interesting to speak of Ceausescu and how, as I said, to the myths of unity and independence, continuity and tension roots were added. And I think that it's important, for instance, to look to the works, to the movies of director Sergiu Nicolaescu. Basically, in 1967 and 1969, the two movies that were produced by Sergiu Nicolaescu, that is, The Dacians and Michael the Brave, spoke, each of them, of two important historical myths. The Dacians spoke of continuity and ancient roots, while Michael the Brave, that was the condottiere that united the Romanian principalities in the 1600s, Romania, that is Wallachia, Moldavia and Transylvania, spoke about unity and struggle for independence, because Michael the Brave fought against the Turks, but also united the Romanian principalities. but I think this is another story. And to conclude, I would just like to say that I think that this nationalistic turn under Dej was heavily influenced by the party myth, emancipation and monolithism, and the expansion of within the group from prison vision of politics to a country scale. And this is how Dej and his men finally got to appeal to the most cherished myths of the Romanians. They actually, finally, those myths that had a resonance in the minds and hearts of the Romanians. Because Romanians were also thinking in terms of unity and independence. And 1958, the withdrawal of the Russian troops also reinforced those ideas that finally the regime was actually starting to work for them. So I think that these ideas would be interesting. Of course, there is much more to do in terms of research, looking at the stories from within, looking at those strategies that were contextually devised, looking at the strategy pursued to pursue the political goals. But after all, I think that looking at the myth of the party and then how they were superimposed on party-state scale would be rewarding and also fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dragos, for a very interesting paper. The organizers have asked me to give a paper, but provide some comments. Let me just preface those by saying I will be, since time is progressing fast and I do want to have some time for discussion, I'll be real brief. In fact, I will cut most of my comments. Let me also again thank Vladimir Tismaneanu and our other co-sponsors and organizers. We have here a set of 4 fine and rich papers. Due to the last-minute changes in the programs, they do not all fit under the session header, the establishment of communist regimes, but let me nonetheless try to compare and connect them, at least to start doing this and raising some issues for the discussion. I should say I will really not comment very much on Dragos's paper. Yeah. I will. Okay. Is this better? I will be not really provide a comment on Dragos's paper, which is kind of outside of separate from the other papers. Just to say that I was intrigued by your bringing into the discussion the notion of historical accidents, and that this is important to keep in mind as we discuss the subject. And secondly, your very interesting points about the superimposition, the merger, if you want, of party myth and national myth in Romania under Dej as a result, in part of 1956. I guess my question would be, as you look at those strategies, have you looked at this from below in terms of the impact of these myths? Let me leave it at that. Turn to quickly to the other 3 papers. Let me start with a paper by Antoni and Bartlomiej Kaminski, On the Road to People's Poland, Stalin's Conquest Revisited. Despite the title, I think much of this paper, as you've heard, is not really concerned with the establishment of Stalinist rule in Poland, but with the international constellation rooted deeply in World War II, if not before, in which that process would take place. It is brings out one of the themes of these 3 papers, in as much as all 3 papers explicate to some extent the connection between Stalinism and the internal developments along with the international narrative of the end of World War II and the beginning Cold War. I was frankly just a bit disappointed by that part of the paper. It seems to me little more than a recount of long-standing accusations that Poland was betrayed by Roosevelt at Yalta. These the words by the authors, and the price paid by Poland was particularly high. This complemented by a few other generalizations. Thus, the authors argue that there was no significant difference between the systems that Hitler and Stalin built, quote, unquote, that the Soviet Union lost the Cold War thanks to the system Stalin built, or that the West won the Cold War without much sacrifice. The authors go back to the collusion of Stalin with Hitler, then jump quickly over a couple of horrifically costly war years to the war's endgame, assessing that both FDR and Churchill were surprisingly obliging and treated Poland as a hostage to fortunes unfolding in war theaters. Why, the authors asked, did we see Poland betrayed? The question is partly answered by pointing out that the big three were really all about the big two, Stalin and FDR, and that Stalin had an upper hand in the negotiation with FDR every step along the way. To my mind, today, this is a fairly simple discussion of the historical process, and I feel it fails to engage some of the recent literature on the subject. If one talks about the international context, I think we have to jump out of the area studies compartment of our niche and engage with some of the literature. And there's a wealth of literature on American policy, on Western policy during World War II and at the beginning of the Cold War. And I think it would have been benefited, this paper, very much. The fact is, military reality shaped much of the constellation at the war's end, and against the background of wartime exigencies, attempted accommodation with Stalin in the war's waning months came neither quickly nor easily. Here I would go back to the very question that Charles Gatti asked yesterday. What incentives from the West could have extended the transition period in Eastern Europe, could have delayed Sovietization, could have changed the fate of Poland? Much more interesting is the question of whether such accommodation had ever a chance of succeeding. And here, the Kaminski paper, in its second part, provides much more richly textured description of how Stalinist rule came to unfold in post-war Poland. And this is where the strength of the paper really lies. And unfortunately, the presentation, he had to cut this rather short. It's a rich paper, very much so in that section. And the authors then raised the intriguing question that gets much more to the core of what I think the session, this conference, is in part all about. Was there, from Moscow's perspective, an optimum level of dependence of a satellite country? And what did that optimum look like? And why did Stalin fail to achieve it in post-war Poland? I'd like to push you more to elaborate on that. If the Kaminski paper underlined the external factors in determining the evolution of polar Stalinism, John Connelly's paper, The Paradox of East German Communism, and his paper is, again, much richer than the very brief and somewhat provocative presentation. John's paper argues that a focus on that international level of analysis distorted our view of Stalinization of the Soviet occupation zone in Germany and the later GDR. Focus on Stalin's inclination to supposedly keep the German question open mitigated against the radical transformation in Eastern Germany that took place elsewhere in Eastern Europe, that being the prevailing opinion. Connelly cites here the work of Wilfried Loth, who claimed that Stalin actually intended an anti-fascist democratic Germany as an extreme example of this kind of logic, of this kind of argument. John, by contrast, argues that East Germany was much more thoroughly transformed than any other country in Eastern Europe in the early post-war years. Germany was ripe for that transformation, as nowhere else in Europe elites had been utterly delegitimized and defining German fascism economically, the Soviets destroyed early on the pre-war economic structures. Denazification did its part in serving as a cover for repressing political opposition, with much help from the Soviet security apparatus actively engaged. John talked about the role of the SMRD. Anti-fascism served as a crucial ingredient in the SED's attempts at self-legitimization, often underrated as a unifying and committing force by historians, and it reinforced loyalty. Anti-fascism reinforced loyalty to party leadership and distorted the leadership's view of the reality in the GDR for much of its existence. Anti-fascism was bound to elicit, as John argues, the greatest attraction, the greatest commitment in the land from which fascism had wrought great destruction. John then proceeds to focus on the fact that East Germany had an open border, which meant that the GDR alone in Europe had been permitted to dispense of its bourgeoisie, of the opposition, rather than to attempt to accommodate to it or to transform it. As John puts it, open borders to the west helped unify the SED. This was largely responsible for the fact that East Germany could avoid the bloody inter-party purges that marked other East Bloc countries in high Stalinism. Of course, the open border brings us back to the international constellation, and I find myself in agreement with much of what John has to say, but I do wonder if he perhaps went a little far in the other direction for the purpose of this paper. Anyways, after all, as much as he emphasizes the thorough political transformation and cultural proclivities, it was East Germany where you had the first major uprising behind the Iron Curtain, and it was an uprising that was certainly went well beyond the demands for economic change. I also wonder whether you can give the open border the kind of function of almost intentional regime stabilizing mechanism. After all, there were real costs to the loss of the GDR of its best and brightest by West immigration, beyond getting rid of opposition elements. And we know that, well, before the 1953 uprising, Ulbricht wanted to shut down this open access. If it had been up to Ulbricht, we would have had the wall in 1952 or 1953. Much as I agree that you can overemphasize the legitimizing power of anti-fascism, much as I agree that you cannot overemphasize the legitimizing power of anti-fascism as a foundational ideology for the new Germany, you can't overemphasize the importance of East Germany's proximity to and exposure to West Germany and to the West for developments in the GDR. Ekaterina Nikova argues that Stalinism in Bulgaria was believed to have been accomplished more easily and implemented in a milder fashion than elsewhere. She argues that if there had been any surprises that come out of the research and the post-Cold War reassessment of the Bulgarian experience, it was the scale of repression and murder committed. In the time of high Stalinism, the paper provides a rich and subtle analysis of how the purges and terror decapitated the pre-war political, economic, and cultural elites, and as she argued, left a tabula rasa for the Sovietization of the country after 1947. On that, she very much meets up with Kaminski's papers, and from this perspective, she then argues, she questions the idea of the democratic intermezzo. That again complements very much John Connelly's findings. These are four interesting, fine, rich papers that make it clear that the Stalinist period, 44 to early 50s, was, first of all, an historically important period, far more violent and transformative than perhaps recognized. The papers also make clear that this period fundamentally shaped the path of the Soviet system in Eastern Europe, even as in some countries its reform was attempted. The papers also underline the important connection between Stalinism and the larger Cold War narrative. Nonetheless, I'm less certain than ever after reading these papers what Stalinism was after the session, what time period it encompassed. The papers look at very different time periods in its what time period Stalinism encompassed in its high form, what its core features, its definition really is. Was it just political control, as John at one point states in his paper? Whether it was preceded by a transition, or if we have overrated the importance, the nature, the existence of this transitional period. And so what does all of this tell us today? What the papers do make clear is that we, I think, need far more comparative research. The papers cry out for such a comparative approach, and we can finally do this at an even level for most of the countries we have been talking about. Even in Albania, not mentioned much here at this conference, archives are now open and research is starting to become possible. At the same time, I think we also need to think far more deeply about the connection between Stalinism and the Cold War. On both of these subjects, these papers and this conference have put us on an exciting and stimulating trajectory or point of departure, whichever one you like. So, floor is open for questions, comments. Yes. If you could please wait for the microphone and state your name.
Alfred Rieber, CEU, Budapest. I think the editors of this volume have a very formidable task. Having listened to 3 sessions now, there's a inherent tension here between the view that each individual country had its own trajectory toward Stalinization, that they were rooted in different historical experiences which go back to empires, as Keith Jowitt reminded us. And on the other hand, we have this image of a single system imposed from above, which took place within 4 years and then was over in its initial phase and was succeeded by a return to individual trajectories as each country interpreted de-Stalinization in a different way. So what are we talking about here as the dominant theme of the conference? I'm left in great confusion. I have 3 quick questions for Professor Kaminski. Why do you think Stalin let Anders and over 150,000 Poles leave the Soviet Union in 1942 to form an army which would inevitably be hostile to the imposition of communism in Poland? Secondly, how would you evaluate the importance, relative importance of the Kresy in economic terms for Poland, as opposed to Silesia and Pomerania? And thirdly, why do you think Stalin wanted to create a homogeneous Poland with an industrial base and a seacoast, all of which would provide Poland with the resources to become a far more stable and developed society than it was before the war?
Thank you. Why don't we take a couple more questions, give Professor Kaminski and others a moment to think about it, all the way in the back.
Max Holland, a former Wilson Fellow.
And excuse me, if those of you who want to speak up could just raise their hands right now so I can... Okay.
I have a question for Professor Connelly. I was wondering if I could get him to comment on whether the concept of Eigensinn is similar to the one of intermigration during the Nazi dictatorship.
Okay, and we'll take all the way to the back. Ambassador Sam.
This is for Dragos Petrescu. It's specific. I found your matrix wonderful and convincing as far as it goes. My question is two developments and how they fit into your matrix. And one is full collectivization in Romania from 58, 59 to 62. It came very late. It was also very violent when it happened. And it was between 56, it was after the withdrawal of Soviet troops, and of course it was while Dej was still alive. The second is the tension of the late 60s between Ceausescu, now first secretary, successor, and the barons around Maurer. And this had to do with the pace of industrialization, I think. And it came out with the neo-Stalinist, national neo-Stalinism of the late Ceausescu regime, sort of came out of that tension. My question would be how these two developments fit into the framework that you have given us.
Thank you. Any questions for Dr. Nikova? Yeah, we'll take one more and then we'll go to the panelists.
Stephen Benedict from New York. You have admitted that in your papers that after the downfall of the communism and the opening of the archives to the scholars, no spectacular or surprising findings were uncovered. Based on this, there are three alternatives. Number one, the Bulgarians were nice and submissive, and therefore there was no need to create files against them. Number two, the archives opened for examinations were not containing all the information. Or number three, all the truth was already told during the communist years, which I doubt very much. So what is the reality?
Okay, well, we start with Professor Kaminski.
This is okay. No, so I see well, the main thrust of your questions is to demonstrate that Poland was benefited from the Soviet Revolution and from communism. I would agree with you on because I think that without the without the October Revolution, I don't think that Poland would have existed in the shape that it does today. I don't think that there would be a political coalition that would really, I mean, assuming that Germany would lose the war, I mean, during the First World War, and assuming that the pattern, the coalition would be the same plus Tsarist Russia, then I have very strong doubts that we would have Poland as it is today. I also agree with you that that Kresy are sort of, probably less attractive than the northwestern part of Poland, which previously belonged to Germany. That Poland's acquisition, I mean moving Poland a couple of hundred, not a couple of hundred, but 100-something miles westward, probably was from a longer point of view, from a longer perspective, is an attractive thing. So here there's no disagreement. I mean it was, I mean, certainly from the point of view of the economic performance, it was a great plus. This sort of reserve in infrastructure, much better developed. Although the Soviet army made sure that there was not much capital equipment left over there. More interesting question is was the question about the Anders army. And I would like to make 2 points. That the argument in the paper, no matter how simplistic this part might be, was that Stalin did not have, I mean, that he was in a different bargaining position, in August of 1941 when he signs the agreements to assure the release of Polish soldiers of Poles who were at the time in various camps in northern parts of the Soviet Union. Then the next step, I mean, it's as the situation, especially after in the early 1942, after the Battle of Moscow was over, and essentially it was the first signs that the tip in the military balance was increasingly was tipped in favor of Stalin. He didn't have any interest in having a Polish army led by officers, many of whom fought in the Polish-Soviet war in 1919-1920, under which was directly responsible to the government in exile. So I think that he found a reason, and the reason was to help pacify some parts of Iran initially, to get rid of the Polish army and then start establishing the army that he would control, that would be totally integrated into the Soviet command. So I don't think anything unusual about that. To the contrary, I see it as part of Stalin's strategy to prepare ground for the takeover of Poland. Similarly, I mean, if I may sort of finish this line of thinking, the fact, I mean, that Polish government in exile was put in a very difficult, was all the time in a very difficult situation, because it had to fight two enemies at the same time: the Soviet Union, which was an ally of United States and Great Britain, and Germany at the same time. So he didn't have much choice, but the decision to sever relations with this, I think that Stalin would have made the decision to sever relationship with the Polish government in exile. He would have found any pretext to do it at some point when already his bargaining position was much stronger in this game. Thank you.
Thank you. Briefly, John.
Okay. Well, thank you also, Cristian, for your comments. I wanted to say something about the proximity to the West. We could talk personally about the other things, but your point is that East Germans actually were very well informed about what was going on in the West, which was true. But this, in some ways, could have led to a kind of schizophrenia, the kind that Ken Jowitt spoke of. That is, that people would act one way in public while privately knowing a lot about another reality that they couldn't address in public. But it also meant, ironically, that the party cadre in East Germany had the most precise information about the West with which to craft real arguments of their own against these Western arguments. So that there was a kind of, if you ever got into a debate with an SED cadre, they really knew your point of view very well. They'd anticipated it. And that led to a certain kind of, again, this cohesiveness of the Marxist-Leninism there that I think was unusual. Question about Eigensinn and inner migration. I think in some ways there are different kinds of concepts. Eigensinn is a more positive one. It's about finding your own way, whereas inner migration is about escaping a reality. Inner migration tends to focus on intellectuals, whereas authors in particular, whereas Eigensinn is really meant by social historians to embrace everyone. But they are indeed very similar. I think there's been an unwillingness in Germany to talk about these kinds of similarities. Really, it's a taboo to do so, to think of, and that is one of the reasons why totalitarianism is not a concept that social historians feel comfortable with, because it automatically brings up these comparisons between Nazi Germany and East Germany. My own view is that they're indeed very different contexts. For example, this inner migration. When people went into inner migration, they were. I know of one case of a writer, Catholic writer, who wrote a series of diaries, and he buried them, 4 feet beneath the ground in his yard. He knew that he would be executed if they were found. In East Germany, you didn't run that kind of risk by, pursuing a kind of inner migration. So the contexts are different. But I think we learn a lot more about each of them by studying them together. So I would say, indeed, there's a similarity, and we should try to learn more about that.
Thank you. Elena?
When I said that there were no great surprises after the opening of the archives, I didn't expect you to take it so literary. I didn't mean that surprises, there were no surprises vis-a-vis the so-called historical truth. I meant more vis-a-vis the historical memory. As I said, during Živkovism, there were leaks of information, very selective pieces of information about the period that were deliberately exposed in order to consolidate Živkov's regime. But what is amazing from my point of view is that deep in the historical memory of people, all this period is preserved. Somebody spoke yesterday about the mass graves, that the villagers knew where the mass graves were. The inmates of the concentration camps knew their whole stories and never told it to their children. The bravery of the agrarians was also very well known. It exists now in the contemporary Bulgarian as a figure of speech. Some of the columns of this oppositional press and people who were born decades after the crash of the agrarians, they use it as a figure of speech. A Soviet colleague told me many years ago, be prepared that your greatest national hero, Georgy Dimitrov, will be demasked. And I said, jokingly, nothing about Dimitrov can surprise us, because when Dimitrov came to Bulgaria, he was, if he ever had this glory of the Leipzig hero, he was a different man. He was a crushed man. He was prematurely aged, alcoholic, very much surrounded by his bodyguards. And even in the historical memory of the Bulgarians, he exists with the nicknames that were given to him by the oppositional press. But as I said, and I want to stress this, the scale of the repressions was the real shock that came to the Bulgarians, that they are now assimilating it.
Thank you. Dragos?
Okay, so first I would like to answer briefly to our commentators' comment. That is, if we have some perceptions from below. Actually, I was listening yesterday to Professor Agnes Heller saying that in 1953, actually, Hungarian communist Stalinists started to speak Hungarian, and this actually enabled the rebellious 56. I would say that we cannot measure this in Romania, but I see that what happened was initiated in 56, 58. We can measure with the support for Ceausescu's policies in August 68. And this means that actually that message reached the hearts and minds of the Romanians. We don't have, and also was Ceausescu's first proof of, and the only proof of charisma. This eroded over time. Then looking back how it fits in my culture structure contingency framework, the question of collectivization and then the debates over industrialization, I think that this proves that actually Dej was not in control of the language of nationalism. Nationalism is not something you can pick up overnight and instrumentalize it skillfully in order to gain legitimacy from your own people that you have or repressed until then. I think that actually it was a period of learning. Jowitt spoke about the diffuse ideology of the Dej group. I think that exactly this, the second wave of terror in 58, continuation of collectivization, really proves the fact they did not know how to instrumentalize nationalism. They had also to gain, they were still thinking that having not achieved full control over society, or own society, they wanted to tame it and then to lure it. So basically this explains, I think, and they learn nationalism over time. Dej did not live long enough to see what actually his strategy of community building actually did, but it was Ceausescu actually to pick up the fruit of this.
Thank you.
Well, industrialization, I see that it was also a continuation of Dej's most cherished dream. I mean, actually, Ceausescu continued the Iron Gate project. It was he who actually finally inaugurated the workings of the hydroelectric power plant. It extended the Galați steelworks combines, and he built another two in Cluj and Iași. So basically, he continued this at a larger scale. Exactly.
Okay, we're already over our time. Somebody surreptitiously compared yesterday afternoon's session to the Bataan March. I don't want this morning's session to become that as well. but I know John Lampe and Vlad. No, okay. John, do you want to pose your question? And Agnes, I'm sorry, had their hands up, so I want to give them the opportunity to ask brief questions.
I sense brief being emphasized. John Lampe, Wilson Center, and senior scholar at the Wilson Center, appreciating these papers. And just briefly, recalling my own experience in the Counterintelligence Corps in West Berlin, 60 to 62, I would just want to say that, for one comment, that John Connelly did not go too far. And that just in general, focusing on, to respond to Al Rieber's concern about how you can put all of this together and define Stalinism, certainly the security services and what they did on a comparative basis with that capacity, unchecked arbitrary power, and also the specter that they increasingly cast, and in the Bulgarian case, a specter inaugurated by the people's courts and the killings before then. That combined with the single leader who is not to be questioned, and kein Fehler Diskussion, I wonder if that couldn't be looked at around the region as well. I'd ask Katja Nikova if kein Fehler Diskussion would fit in the Bulgarian case, and also if some of the younger scholars in the region in Bulgaria have, if there's one or two she would recommend to us, because part of this inquiry should recognize that scholarship in the languages from the region is starting to come forward.
I think that's a very, very good point, John. I'll take that more as a comment rather than a question. Dr. Heller.
To be brief to John Connelly's paper, it was very interesting when you proved that the schemes cannot apply to DDR, to East Germany, or the schemes, since DDR was not Stalinized before 56, became far more terroristic after 56. My question is the following: whether you took into consideration that because what you mentioned, that they claim themselves to be the anti-fascist, they could become nationalistic. That West Germany could not claim to be nationalistic, but East Germany, precisely because they were anti-fascist, they were to other Germany. There was an open nationalism in East Germany, and they claimed the whole German culture because the whole German culture was in fact in East territory, from Luther to Wagner, from Goethe to Heine, everyone from there, Heine Roth, but they could claim, and that is very important, very simple thing. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were Germans, and that made a very great difference between the relationship to the tradition, national tradition of the East Germans in communism, and the relationship to the national tradition of other East European countries.
Thank you. John, between us and lunch.
Okay. Well, there is actually there's lots of research has been done on this subject, especially in the 1980s, because there was a Prussia boom suddenly in the early 1980s, and selectively the East German leadership had appropriated parts of the East German past, beginning in really the early post-war period, the so-called progressive forces, and it did that explicitly, and less explicitly, of course, it involved itself in the use of uniforms and other kinds of insignia that were very reminiscent goose step of earlier times. I told somebody that there used to be a Mahnmal für die Opfer des Faschismus, this memorial for the victims of fascism, and they had the changing of the guard there. With a goose step, and they would say, for the Opfer des Faschismus, and then they would march off goose stepping, and I never saw a more fascistic act in my life, and it was for the victims of fascism. Let me just say, so it was a kind of a subtle melange of things that were done explicitly and less explicitly, but it was schizophrenic. And I'll give you, there was one family I used to visit. They had one picture of a young man in a black border wearing a Wehrmacht uniform. Okay. And that is a tradition that they never talked about. You could never talk about the history of Germans fighting for the Germany of the Third Reich. That was completely suppressed. Memory of that, discussion of that was simply it was a non-issue. It was in the Gute Stube, it was in the living room of this family, but nobody. This is Uncle Fred, he was a non-person really. This young man in the Wehrmacht uniform. So there was one vital component of German history that was erased from that place. They never addressed that openly, and we could talk at greater length, but those would be my comments for that.
Thank you. I want to second Dr. Rieber's remarks of the formidable challenge that Vlad has in front of him in putting this volume together. Nonetheless, these were
There was
four...
a question to me.
Oh, there was a question to you?
Yes, and that I didn't answer.
I was going to take that more as a comment, but sure, go ahead if you want to.
To the question of the single person heading the Bulgarian Communist Party for the next 35 years, I think the soil was prepared in this period. Yes. The purges within the Communist Party of Bulgaria did prepare the soil for the next personal regime of Todor Živkov. Because in the course of 6 months, the three leading figures of Bulgarian communism, and to a certain extent world communism, like Georgi Dimitrov, Vasil Kularov, and Traicho Kostov, died. They say Kostov was executed, but Vasil Kularov and Georgi Dimitrov died under suspicious circumstances, they say. So the purges within the party were really marked another sad Bulgarian record. Every fifth Bulgarian communist by the year of 1950 was either expelled or put to trial or sentenced to various to prison. So the whole party hierarchy was shaken, and the party which sometimes had its tradition was sank into mediocrity and turned into a bureaucratic, obedient structure because the Bulgarians got the lesson, were taught the lessons of obedience.
Thank you. Thank you all for 4 very stimulating, rich papers. I highly recommend you look at the papers too and get copies. They're even richer than the presentations. Thank you. Thank you for listening. 2:30, we resume proceedings.
Unless we are clapping for Cristian.
Thank you. Very stimulating.
Too much to say, really, I was actually like you. You were sort of returning to the subject after many years of not dealing with it. Is that correct?
Yeah, many years.
So what was the name for...
Welcome back, everyone, to the next panel. I'm Charles King from Georgetown University, and I, like Cristian Osterman, will be both the chair, as it were, of the panel and the discussant to make a few remarks at the very end. It's often the case that with panels after lunch, they end up being difficult panels. This will not be that case. Will not be the case with this one because we have a number of very exciting presenters and a number of very exciting papers as well. You have the list of presenters and their affiliations before you, and we'll simply go in the order as listed on the program, beginning with Bradley Abrams from the Harriman Institute at Columbia University, and continuing Cristian Vasile, Bogdan Iacob, and actually maybe I have an older version of this because Svetozar Stojanovic, who is listed first now. Okay, then second we'll go with Svetozar Stojanovic and then continue on as listed in the new program. So we'll begin first with Bradley Abrams. Everyone, by the way, will have 20 minutes to present, and I'll flag you with a 3-minute warning when you're there at the end.
Thank you, Charles. I hate hearing my voice amplified, so you'll have to bear with me on this. I'd also like to thank all the organizers for this opportunity to come and hear all of these papers, and also to make my own little contribution to it. As many of you know, I've written fairly extensively over the past few years, say 10 years, on the immediate post-war developments in Czechoslovakia. And I'm going to draw a lot, but not exclusively on those writings, to discuss the Czechoslovak road to socialism and the Czechoslovak road to Stalinism as two different but deeply related phenomena. The first is relatively straightforward. In what I'm going to call the Czechoslovak road to socialism, I will focus on domestic rather than international events and briefly, very briefly, examine the most important turning points on the path that took the country from liberation to communist domination of the political space. Secondly, I'd like to interweave into this a discussion of the, in quotes, specific Czechoslovak road to socialism, the Communist Party's political offensive that began in the fall of 1946, tacitly indicating a divergence from Soviet practices. Its ultimate failure, which only occurred months after the Communist Party's gaining of total power in February of 1948, has international roots. And the story of this failure can be seen as the story of the Czechoslovak road to Stalinism. Of course, there could be no Czechoslovak road to Stalinism without a Czechoslovak road to socialism, since it prepared the ground domestically for the international pressures that led to Czechoslovakia's Sovietization, or Stalinization. Nonetheless, I want to keep these two notionally separate in order to foreground Czechoslovakia's specificities. Now, a host of recent research has shown the enthusiasm among Czechs for radical social change in the wake of the Second World War. However, already during the war, fateful decisions were made by the bourgeois-led government in exile. For example, it decided to limit the number of political parties, resulting in a truncated political sphere or political spectrum that was decidedly skewed to the left. Further, President Edvard Beneš's 1945 decrees, decided during the war, also fed the cause of socialism by nationalizing all banks, insurance companies, and large industrial enterprises. This meant that almost 60% of industrial output came from the state sector, and 60%, a little more than 60% of the workforce was employed by the state sector. Similarly, planning was introduced into the economy with the formulation of a 2-year plan for 1946 to 1948. Both the nationalizations and the introduction of planning were accompanied by the support of the non-communist parties and found widespread popular approval. These and other steps, including the beginnings of a large-scale land reform, were part of the strivings for radical social reform that were summed up by President Beneš's description of post-war Czechoslovakia as a socializing democracy. The ultimate destination of this socializing was never made clear, however, and its intonation allowed room for the communists' specific Czechoslovak road to socialism to seize important rhetorical space. Now, Communist Party leaders proclaimed this specific Czechoslovak road to socialism in the fall of 1946. Though announced after Stalin had indicated his tolerance for this kind of variety, the Czechoslovak Party was perhaps the best equipped of the Eastern European communist parties to take advantage of the opening. It had carefully reinvented itself as national patriotic and democratic, and the elements that the party stressed as being components of this specific Czechoslovak road were precisely those that were so popular: socialism, the National Front government, the nationalizations, the 2-year plan, as well as the aim of gaining an electoral majority in democratic elections. The larger picture here, I think, is clear. Communists and non-communists alike were committed to building a new Czechoslovakia on the basis of radical social change. They talked of socialism and socializing democracy without specifying what the socialism being sought would consist in, and the Czechoslovak public was supportive of the changes being made in this vague socialism's name. This judgment is borne out by the results of the first post-war elections, held in May of 1946. In them, and they were widely seen as free and fair even by the communist political opponents, the communists won a decisive victory, gaining over 40% of the Czech vote, and together with their social democratic ally, secured a majority of the vote nationwide. There are two important features, I think, of the results, beyond the fact that the communists did so well, which should be obvious. First of all, in the Czech lands, where 4 parties contested the elections, almost 4/5 of the electorate gave their votes to expressly socialist parties. So socialism of some stripe was undoubtedly important and desirable to the Czech public. Second, the Communist Party of Slovakia, the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, the notionally Czech party's sister party in Slovakia, did more poorly, managing to gain only a little over 30% of the vote, despite the fact that it faced only one serious opponent, the Democratic Party, it was called. This brings me to my second point, which has to do with Czech-Slovak relations. The electoral result certainly showed the differing strengths of socialism in the two halves of the country. But the reactions to these results showed something that I think is more important. In the wake of the elections, the communists came to government meetings, hoping to weaken the power of the Democratic Party, the one that had beaten the communists in Slovakia, by weakening Slovak regional governing institutions, institutions which had been granted considerable powers after liberation. Instead of meeting opposition from Czech non-communists, Czech and Slovak communists found them to be willing to sharply curtail Slovak autonomy. Here it seems that the Czech non-communists regarded the Democratic Party as a reactionary threat to the socialist aims they shared with the communists, and that largely because of this, Slovakia itself constituted a political problem. This problem reared its head again in April of 1947 in connection with the question of granting clemency to the leader of the wartime Slovak state, Josef Tiso, who had been sentenced to death. At that time, Catholic leaders argued that he should be given clemency as a nod toward Slovak national and religious sensibilities. The communists argued for carrying out the death penalty and achieved victory with the support of the Czech Social Democrats and the non-Marxist National Socialists, who, this is always followed by the tagline, not related to their German counterpart. Okay. All these steps, to my mind, deeply harmed Czech-Slovak relations and led to the ease with which the communists could diminish the Democratic Party's influence, separate the Czech non-communists from the Slovak non-communists, and remove the Democratic Party from power in Slovakia in February of 1948. Now, within months of the Tiso trial, in the summer of 1947, the question of Czechoslovakia's participation in the Marshall Plan came to center stage. In the standard telling, and if anybody here doesn't know this, the Czechoslovak government agreed to participate, and then important leaders were called to Moscow, where Stalin browbeat them into changing their minds. It's true that the Czechoslovak government unanimously, that is, including the communists, approved participation in the Paris organizing talks. It's also true that a Czechoslovak delegation met with Stalin a few days later, and that the Czechoslovak government thereafter rescinded its decision regarding participation. What this account omits, however, is that after hearing from Communist Party head Klement Gottwald prior to their meeting with Stalin that the Soviet leader was angry, non-communist foreign minister Jan Masaryk and the National Socialist leader who was accompanying him agreed to go and talk to Stalin and to explain to him why participation was important to Czechoslovakia. In the event, the minutes of the meeting record near the very front, not the first thing that Masaryk says, but one of the first things that Masaryk says, Minister Masaryk emphasized that all political parties are agreed that Czechoslovakia may not undertake anything which would be against the interests of the Soviet Union. But Minister Masaryk here requests that the Soviet Union help us in our delicate situation. Perhaps the matter can be fixed in such a manner that we would go to the conference on one day and leave it on the next. Now, what's remarkable about this is that Masaryk, the foreign minister of a sovereign state, made little show of defending an action taken unanimously by his state's government. Rather, he devoted his energies to finding a way to maintain the appearance that his state was acting with sovereignty, while reassuring Stalin that Soviet interests, in fact, took precedence over Czechoslovak ones. This may have egged Stalin on, as Al Rieber pointed out. Is Al here? I guess not. As Al Rieber pointed out yesterday, to demand an immediate reversal, which was in fact forthcoming. The reversal shows that the Czechoslovak political elite was willing to sacrifice heavily in order not to provoke the Kremlin. Given that of all the Eastern European states on the road to communist dictatorship, Czechoslovakia arguably had the most room for maneuver, one has to ask how its representatives used that room. If Czechoslovak sovereignty was damaged by the whole episode, and it certainly was, it was damaged by the Czechoslovak political elite itself. This can be seen as the first step on the road to Stalinism. We're still in the road to socialism, but this can be seen as the first step on the road to Stalinism. But it was in many ways a self-Stalinizing step on the part of the Czechoslovak government. Now, my final example here is the Common Forum meeting in Šklarska Poręba a few months later in September of 1947, where, as we've all already heard, the French and Italian communists were subjected to sharp criticism, while Yugoslavia escaped, as Al Rieber and Ivo Banac both pointed out. Now, less well known is that Zhdanov's penultimate draft of the memo on the content for the planned meeting, which he submitted to Stalin, contained the points, and I quote, criticism of mistakes made by certain communist parties, French, Italian, Czechoslovak, and others. This was only changed in the final memo to criticism of mistakes made by certain communist parties, especially the mistakes of the French and Italian communist parties. Now, although the Czechoslovaks received no direct criticism, it sent a clear signal to the party that the national roads policy was no longer being actively pursued by the Soviet leadership. It's not surprising, then, that there was a sharp reduction in the deployment of this specific Czechoslovak road to socialism. Now, I say reduction in and not end to, because several important figures in the party continued to invoke it right up to February of 1948, and more importantly, its main elements continued to occupy center stage in the Communist Party's behavior, even if not expressly labeled part of this specific Czechoslovak road. Now, the Czechoslovak road to socialism did, of course, end in socialism. Actually, given the conditions in 1945, it almost started with socialism, but I'll leave that to the side for now. But the story doesn't end in February of 1948. I'm not going to go into detail here about the various misjudgments that plagued the decision of non-communist ministers to resign over the communist clear attempt to pack the police leaderships. Briefly, I want to point out, though, that they relied on a frail President Benes not to accept their resignations and clearly did not consider any other way of resolving the crisis that they themselves had caused through discussions and early elections. Further, they neither ensured that a majority of ministers would resign, prompting the collapse of the government, nor forewarned their local leaderships of the step they were taking, such that their supporters could be easily mobilized. Now, the communists, for their part, seem to have been caught off guard by the resignations, but they responded quickly. Within days, hundreds of thousands of protesters filled the streets of Czech cities and towns. On the 25th of February, a crowd of 250,000 pro-communist demonstrators in Prague and hundreds of thousands elsewhere across the nation waited for President Benes to declare whether he would accept the communist solution for the crisis, which was a reconstructed National Front government with only those from non-communist parties that the communists considered to be reliable allowed to participate. Now, in the face of all this, Benes conceded defeat, and the communist victory was complete. Now, it is the shock of suddenly achieving total power that I believe partially explains why Czechoslovakia's road to socialism ended in February of 1948, but the complete transformation of this road into a road to Stalinism was yet to come. Here I would posit that the communists' own specific Czechoslovak road to socialism acted as a bridge between the two. Rushed into power, the communists, it seems, did not know what to do. However, the shock of achieving total power is only part of the reason why the Czechoslovak road to Stalinism was not coterminous with the Czechoslovak road to socialism. The other factor is what Gordon Skilling has called the dualism of Czechoslovak communism. The party's politics had traditionally been split between a more moderate parliamentary course. Remember, they were the only Eastern European Communist Party not banned in the interwar years, which defended national sovereignty and relied on social democratic traditions dating back into the 19th century. There was also, however, a more dogmatic aspect, which cleaved to the Soviet Union and properly Bolshevik traditions. In the months after the party claimed power, schizophrenia in the party's behavior was particularly evident. I believe that some sections of the party believed that Czechoslovak socialism would, in fact, be distinctive, and that the condemnation of Yugoslavia in June of 1948 at the Cominform meeting tipped the balance towards a Stalinist variant. The changes that took place in the immediate aftermath of February were not systematically implemented, and many were carried out without the party's leadership. For example, just quick examples, as John Connelly has pointed out, there was a purge of the professorate. That was not carried out by the party itself, but by self-appointed action committees established as the crisis was unfolding. These activist students were not only fired by revolutionary zeal, but also by intergenerational animosity. Other similar actions were undertaken by action committees in other spheres of social life. Just as sort of a funny example, in the Union for Czechoslovak-American Friendship. This happened particularly in local government and in the factories. However, it must be recognized that, unlike we heard about Bulgaria this morning, the purge in Czechoslovakia affected only a small minority, with the much wider purge coming in 1949 and 1950. More importantly, however, there were very strong elements of continuity with pre-February conditions. On the symbolic level, there was the fact that Foreign Minister Masaryk stayed at his post until his admittedly quite mysterious death on the 10th of March, and President Benes remained in office until abdicating on June 7th. Similarly, the pre-February parties continued to function. Although in this early period, the party entered into negotiations with the Roman Catholic Church, attempting to settle such thorny issues as religious education and the disposition of church land. Now, there are several aspects of this kind of continuity in the post-February course that I could discuss, but I would like to focus very briefly on two: the May 1948 elections and the Constitution that came into effect in that month. The elections had long been scheduled for the 30th of May, and the Communist Party was faced with the question of how to conduct them. For 6 weeks after achieving a monopoly of power, the top leadership maintained that they would be multi-party, consistent with the party's pre-February attempt to gain an electoral majority. Now, the party continued with this aim, although revising it upward, claiming that they wanted to internally that they wanted to achieve 75% of the vote, until the 5th of April, when it became evident that it would fall short of its goal by perhaps 5 to 10%, which is they're still doing quite well, likely gaining somewhere between 65 and 70%. It was only at this relatively late date that the party decided to field a united slate of candidates. A similar sense of continuity and moderation, or this sort of social democratic aspect of the Czechoslovak dualism, can be seen in the May Constitution, which has been called a unique specimen, sui generis, which had no equal within the Soviet-controlled orbit. It was an elaborate hybrid, a combination of Western parliamentarianism with Sovietism. Among the Western elements that have been noted were the retention of the parliamentary system, the separation of powers, protection against arbitrary arrest, the renunciation of preliminary censorship, the protection of private ownership of land up to 50 hectares, and of small enterprises up to 50 employees. To be sure, there were also present strong elements of communist, I guess what I'll call constitution craft. Nonetheless, its hybrid quality shows, I think, particularly well the sort of dualist nature of Czechoslovak communism. Now, I would argue, alongside Ivo Banac, that it was the expulsion of Yugoslavia from the Cominform in June of 1948 that pushed the Czechoslovak leadership forward. Only after this meeting, and against the background of deepening shortages and rising black market prices, did the regime rapidly accelerate on its road to Stalinism. The importance of the split should come as no surprise, given the Czechoslovak Party's narrow escape at the 1947 Cominform meeting, and its moderation relative to the USSR and other Eastern European states in the months after gaining total power. already at June 28th, the day that the resolution was announced, at a June 28th meeting of the party presidium, the leadership realized that changes would have to be made. This sense was made concrete when Stalin criticized the party's policies in a meeting with Clement Gottwald in late September. Okay. Perhaps the most instructive example of the change in policy comes from the party's attitude towards membership. The party had roughly 1.5 million members in February of 1948, and new ones were added at a dizzying rate thereafter, without much concern at all, really any concern, for class origins or previous political affiliation, as the party's moderate social democratic tradition continued. This policy of inclusion added over 1 million new members between February and mid-July, when the next count was done. Now, in the wake of the Common Form resolution on Yugoslavia, however, the leadership decided on the 11th of July to halt its massive recruitment drive. Now, this policy was taken to the next level only in the fall, after Gottwald's discussions with Stalin. So it's sort of a two-step road here. One is after June 28th of 48, and one is after these September discussions. In October of 1948, the party had 2.5 million members, representing over 20% of Czechoslovakia's total population. So it looks less like a cadre party and a lot more like the Yugoslav Communist Party at this particular moment. So after Gottwald's meeting with Stalin, the leadership decided to roll back its number through a certification of all party members, a provierka, for anybody who knows the word. By January of 1949 already, it had shed more than 250,000 members. The beginning of the purge was not the only measure that the regime took in the fall of 1948, however. Rapid change came in almost every sphere in the fall of 1948 and the spring of 1949. For example, in the last 3 months of 1948, a law on forced labor camps was passed. This is a clear sign of Stalinization, I think. The 5-Year Plan Act was promulgated. The government abolished the historical provinces of Bohemia, Moravia, and Slovakia, and a Czechoslovak-Soviet trade agreement was ratified, slating to increase trade between the two states by 45% at the expense of Czechoslovak trade with the West. Additionally, preliminary censorship was begun. Preliminary censorship was begun, and the Union of Czechoslovak Youth began checking the reliability of the university's students. Finally, a law on the defense of the People's Democratic Republic, which gave itself over to wide abuse, was passed as the first step of a legal 2-year plan that significantly altered the state's civil, criminal, and penal codes. The run-up to the party's 9th Congress in May of 1949 was equally busy, as the party created its new Stalinist line. 1 month after the establishment of Comecon in January, a law on economic planning was passed. And complementing this, the regime adopted the Unified Agricultural Collectives Act in February, creating the legal framework for the collectivization of agriculture, Ken Jowitt's signature feature of Stalinism. These two measures extended the reformation of the economy along Soviet lines. Across the military, officers were purged and political officers added. The regime also moved to cripple the Catholic Church, passing laws requiring government sanction for all religious appointments, closing ecclesiastical offices to those convicted in civil court, and requiring a loyalty oath. After this burst of activity that Stalinized Czechoslovakia over the fall of 1948 and spring of 1949, the party, state, and social institutions experienced very little change before Stalin's death. All energies in this era were consumed by the hunting down, trying, imprisoning, and fairly often executing thousands of enemies, real enemies and imagined enemies of the regime. And I think that's, well, here's just one brief paragraph. From 1945 to 1948, to sort of sum this up, to late 1948, there were really two major struggles occurring simultaneously. The first was between the Communist Party and its opponents in other parties. This is a battle over the Czechoslovak road to socialism, commenced during World War II, but intensified thereafter, with socialism emerging victorious in February of 48. The other battle was occurring simultaneously within the Communist Party, between more moderate and national ideas and those more amenable to Stalinism. And this comes to an end after the Yugoslav expulsion and with Stalinism victorious in the fall of 1948. And that's the trajectory of the Czechoslovak road to Stalinism. Thank you.
Okay, let me stay seated. I have some health problems. My back is in bad shape anyway. I simply am going to read from a long paper which I'm going to submit to the eventual publication. Of course, I'm going to read only certain parts. As you probably know from the program, the title of my paper is Varieties of Stalinism in Light of the Yugoslav Case. What is the time now in Moscow? This is a line from Dobrica Ćosic's Serbian novelist book, The Sinner. What is the time now in Moscow? I think it is one of the best metaphors about international Stalinism. The time in Moscow did indeed change continually and unforeseeably in rhythm with the super despot's twists and turns, while all the other communist parties set their own clocks in time with the Kremlin's. Of course, until the Yugoslav communists began, so to say, asking what is the time now in Belgrade. Now, the first fragment, really, diffuse Stalinism. The real Stalinism, however, was somewhat a diffuse phenomenon. This is why I have long time ago proposed some conceptual and other distinctions for it by particularly using the example of the Yugoslav Communist Party. Let me elaborate once more on that. From the time of their formation, communist parties in Eastern Europe were the almost 3 decades in opposition, in underground, under foreign occupation, and not in power, as was the Soviet Communist Party. The former were able to realize their full Stalinist potential only after assuming power in their countries. One should also not underestimate the difference between the Stalinism of the Yugoslav Communist Party during the anti-fascist and civil war and revolution 41-45 on the one hand, and the ruling Stalinism in Yugoslavia once that party assumed power on the other hand. Furthermore, Stalinism in power was one thing, and the Stalinism of the communist parties in Western democracies was another. That parliamentarism lied at one end of the Stalinist spectrum and totalitarianism lied at the opposite end. As Stalinism was the result of a process, its phases and degrees have to be differentiated. In that process, even the incomplete Stalinists were eliminated. For this reason, the key question is to what degree had the Communist Party of Yugoslavia become Stalinized prior to Stalin's onslaught in 1948. 3 years in power had apparently not been sufficient for that party to complete the Stalinization process. It is also important to note that the Yugoslav Communist Party's ideology in 1948 was completely Stalinized, whereas in practice some important differences with Moscow had already accumulated. In Yugoslavia as well, there was a pronounced difference between the Stalinists as initiators, orderers, and executors of mass terror, and the Stalinists who were naive believers. Let me say that the political regimes in the first Yugoslavia actually abetted the hardcore Stalinists, a special type being the convict Stalinists, the hardcore Stalinists by their harsh persecution of communists. It would also be unjustified to equate the uninformed Stalinists with those who became Stalinists even though they were well informed. Up until the end of World War II, there was only a minuscule number of Yugoslav communists who knew about the real situation, what the real situation was like in the USSR. the rest living at a great distance and possessing scant knowledge of Soviet affairs, were Stalinists in the sense that they blindly supported Stalin, Soviet Communist Party, and the Soviet Union in the belief that communist ideals were genuinely being materialized there. Neither should we pass over generalized judgments on the Stalinists because of the generational differences. An important component of idealistic as against realistic Stalinism was the utopian nature of the communist youth. The highly developed Soviet Stalinism was marked by terrorist industrialization, terrorist statization of agriculture, and terrorist purges in the Soviet Communist Party itself. The conflict between the Communist Party of Yugoslavia and Stalin, however, occurred at a time of the fairly enthusiastic, not mass terrorist industrialization of Yugoslavia. More importantly, it occurred at a time when the Communist Party of Yugoslavia had not yet irreversibly plunged into the mass terrorist collectivization of the village. Stalinism moved in a vicious circle of self-enlarging and self-justifying mass terror. Even the most active manifestation of loyalty to Stalin was not enough to save anyone from wholly arbitrary terrorization. Under such circumstances, a mood of panic spread rapidly and even penetrated intimate human relations. In a certain sense, the family was the basic foundation of the expanded reproduction of Stalinist totalitarianism. In those days, school children brought home a godlike image of Stalin. Distraught parents most certainly dared not to call this image into question in front of their children, but sometimes even bent over backwards to uphold and strengthen it. And in order not to collapse under the burden of self-debasement, many parents convinced themselves that the super cult of Stalin was justified. A similar totalitarian mechanism was operative in Yugoslavia, of course not to the same extent, with regard to Tito and his leadership, both before the break with Stalin and even more so with the heightened terrorization after the break for a period. Unless one perceives the differences among the Stalinists, it is also impossible to understand what was to happen subsequently during the de-Stalinization process, or the liberal communist reforms, or finally the recent implosion of communism. Some idealistic and naively loyal Stalinists, such as, for example, Gorbachev and his associates, became later transformed into the principal initiators and leaders of communist reformism, and even into decisive actors in the process of the self-negation of communism. The second portion. Stalinist anti-Stalinism in Yugoslavia. The biggest irony in the Communist Party's Yugoslavia's history, however, was that its most Stalinist potential was manifested only at the time it openly resisted Stalin. This is why I have described more than 40 years ago Tito's initial no to Stalin as a Stalinist anti-Stalinism. In doing so, I primarily had in mind the forced establishment of the so-called peasant work cooperatives that were dissolved only after Stalin's death. I also had in mind the imprisonment of bourgeois elements in the Popular Front, the annihilation of the last remnants of small private businesses and trades, the brutal terrorization of real or imputed Cominformists, the convictions based on earlier Soviet denunciations, and even the execution in Slovenia of a group of former Dachau and Buchenwald concentration camp inmates. When we analyze the Titoist treatment of the Cominformists in their own ranks from 1948 onwards, we must also bear in mind the distinction among the Stalinists. A good many communists were imprisoned as being Cominformists only because they insisted that their leaders should have attended a Cominform meeting in Bucharest in order to defend themselves from the accusations leveled against them. They had no inkling of the possibility that such a delegation would not have returned to Yugoslavia alive. The leadership, headed by Tito, who in his own words experienced Stalin's attack with great astonishment, the leadership headed by Tito was thoroughly acquainted with the situation in the USSR. Yet that leadership required the communists, who were quite ignorant about all this, to take up a proper attitude straight away. Such communists were not even aware of the real nature of their own leadership, and naively responded to the call freely to voice their opinion of the Cominform resolution against the Yugoslav Communist Party at their party meetings. The narrowest top leadership of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia was quite patient with some of the leaders who were hesitant. But at the same time, the leadership hurriedly arrested the young and ill-informed Cominformists. Incidentally, Stalin committed a serious blunder in 1948 by disparaging the Yugoslav Communist Party and its wartime and revolutionary contribution, thereby alienating numerous idealistic Stalinists in the Communist Youth League and in the Yugoslav Communist Party. The Titoist leadership that had taught the communists to worship Stalin now required them virtually overnight to turn against him. The realistic Stalinists, Tito and Kardelj especially, before all others, who had sojourned in Moscow before the war and were best acquainted with Stalinism, began dealing brutally with even the youngest Stalinist idealists. Not only were the Cominformists subjected to torture, but their families, friends, and even some chance acquaintances were also persecuted. What course would our history have taken had Stalin not demanded the overthrow of Tito and his trio, Kardelj, Rankovic, and Gilas, but had continued setting them up as models to other communist leaders and had them craftily induced them to forge ahead into the mass terrorist collectivization of agriculture, into a more rapid and more radical nationalization of private property, into still more brutal persecution of bourgeois elements, into the organization of countless trials similar to the so-called Dachau and Buchenwald trials. In a word, if he had urged them to turn the whole of Yugoslavia into a specific Gulag archipelago. After all, Stalin's emissaries at the first Cominform meeting in 1947 had already induced the Yugoslav delegation arrogantly to criticize the French and Italian communist parties, and thus unwittingly to contribute to its own isolation when its turn came the following year. And what would have ensued if Stalin had allowed Tito to create a Balkan federation with Bulgaria and Albania and to integrate it straight away into a kind of Warsaw Alliance, which was established only in 1949, after Tito had already successfully defected, and then had militarily intervened against Yugoslavia by invoking these international institutions. However, nothing of all this would have been indispensable to Stalin in his younger days. He would have known how to invite Tito and his trio to some celebration, give them a handful of medals and decorations, and then arrange for them to perish in an airplane accident on their way home, let's say. He wouldn't have had the occasion to mourn them at their funeral, just as he did at Kirov's. True, Stalin missed doing this as early as mid-1946, when Tito was last in the USSR, before the rift. Subsequently, using various pretexts, Tito sent others from among the leadership to the Soviet Union. Let me read you a footnote here, I think interesting to everybody. Gilas was in Moscow at the last meeting before the conflict broke out. On that occasion, something occurred that he has never made public, but which I learned from him personally. Namely, in January 1990, the Moscow journal Literarная Gazeta and the Belgrade weekly Nin arranged in Moscow a Soviet-Yugoslav discussion on the Stalin-Tito conflict. Of the Yugoslavs, among others, Gilas and I participated. After Gilas spoke, I asked him whether Stalin had ever suggested that evening, of course that was the night, had ever suggested in one way or another that he, Gilas, should assume Tito's position. Gilas responded by describing the following scene. In Stalin's dacha, during a working dinner, as they call it, attended by the highest Soviet leaders and of the Yugoslavs only by Gilas, at a certain moment the conversation lapsed and was followed by a long silence. All those present fixed their eyes on Gilas, who intuitively felt, he said so to me, that Stalin was about to suggest a change in the Yugoslav leadership. So he, Gilas, broke the silence by an abrupt, warm praise of Tito. After a while, Stalin cut Gilas short with an energetic, dismissive wave of his hand and a sharp look, returning to topics of the previous conversation. Now, to come to the main line of my text. This is one of the reasons for the paradoxical conclusion, all what I said, that the CPU could not have, Communist Party of Yugoslavia, could not have successfully resisted Stalin had it not been led by a Tito with his Stalinist characteristic and experience. After the break with Stalin, Tito and his ideologies restyled earlier differences, even lifting them to mythic proportions by means of hindsight projections. We were to believe that when Tito assumed the leadership of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia on the eve of World War II, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia was a non-Stalinist, almost anti-Stalinist. This was a case of retroactive metaphysics. The essence of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia was the same both when it obsequiously followed Stalin and would wrench itself from his coattails. And the final portion, Yugo-Stalinism and anti-fascist patriotism. On the eve of Hitler's attack on Yugoslavia, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia was a fully disciplined section of the Communist International. The leading Yugoslav Stalinists endeavored primarily to assist the Soviet Union, overthrow the government in their country, and integrate it into the USSR as one of the republics. They supported Stalin's pact with Hitler. We need only look at resolution of the 5th National Conference of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, dated 1940, which defined World War II as an imperialist war and stated that the English and French imperialists sparked a new conflict. Unless one clearly differentiates the motivation of the leading communists from that of the younger ones, one cannot understand the relationship between Stalinism and patriotic anti-fascism. These two components of Yugo-communism were in a state of tension, but Stalinism became dominant as soon as the question of priority was raised, because for the communist leaders, patriotic anti-fascism possessed an instrumental and not intrinsic value. After all, the essential feature of Stalinist totalitarianism was to treat everyone and everything as a sheer means to an end. As the liberation war in Yugoslavia grew in momentum, so did the aspiration of the communists to monopolize anti-fascism. For this reason, the 4th July 1941 date was finally selected to mark the beginning of the uprising, as it was on that day that the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, Politburo, called for the armed struggle. As long as it could, the leadership glossed over the fact that the armed struggle had been launched before that date by the non-communist Serbs in Croatia and in Bosnia and Herzegovina in their efforts to save themselves from the Ustashi genocidal assault. The official history of the National Liberation War did not ascribe any significant difference to what the Chetniks represented on the one side and the Nedic, Ljotic, and even the Ustashi formations on the other. In order to understand what I mean by this, I must first remind the reader, or to you listener, of the existence of two crucially different dimensions in Serbian tradition. One such tradition is the rebel deontological one, and the second is the opportunist utilitarian tradition. The first was manifested, for example, in the desire to reject in entirety the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum in 1914, in the refusal to accept the Yugoslav government's pact with Hitler in 1941, as well as in the outbreak of the partisan and Chetnik uprisings against the occupiers in that same year. The second tradition was manifested in the partial acceptance of the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum by the Serbian government, in the signing of the accord with Hitler on March 25, 1941, in the goodwill shown to him, this is the end, in the goodwill shown to him by the new Simovic government as soon as it assumed power after 27 March 1941 coup d'etat, in the Chetnik decision to refrain from continuing the uprising, and most of all in the Nedic-Quisling government and its armed struggle against the partisans up to the end of the war. In Serbian history, these two dominant tendencies constantly conflict and interplay and occasionally mitigate each other's effects. When a fatal danger appears to threaten their national dignity or independence, the rebel deontological elite often prevails by bestowing its voice to the masses and their actions, but also by conveying the impression that the majority of the Serbs are ready to sacrifice their lives for higher values. It is in this light that I see what was happening in Serbia during 41-44 occupation. As is known, the partisans and the Chetniks rose against the German occupying forces and succeeded in freeing a considerable area of Serbia in the second half of 1941. However, the two groups of freedom fighters became soon separated, not only as to their ultimate wartime aims, but also by dint of the defeat of the uprising, and especially by their attitudes to the mass reprisals against the civilian population. The German troops executed 100 Serb civilians for each of their soldiers killed and 50 for each who was wounded. The final paragraph short. The bulk of the partisans fled beyond Serbia, while the few remaining ones did not cease harassing the enemy, despite the civilian casualties. These sacrifices, however, shocked the Chetniks of Draža Mihailović and marked them psychologically and politically until their final collapse. It is not yet time to fight, became the Chetnik watchword. They waited more or less for the Allied victory over Hitler and then to participate in the war, in the concluding military operations, and impose a solution of the question as to who the post-war rulers in Yugoslavia would be. Meanwhile, the Chetniks went on fighting the partisans, with the latter paying them in the same coin. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leo. Next, Cristian Vasile.
I also thank Vladimir Tismaneanu, the organizers and sponsors, for this opportunity. And I would begin by saying that immediately after the communist takeover, the Romanian Communist Party's list of things to be done included also the problem of the creation of a new culture, a Soviet-type one, although the official discourse repeatedly stressed that this new culture, it will be built by the working class. In fact, its genesis was attentively and exclusively watched by the leadership of the Communist Party through the agency of a dreaded organ which belonged to the structure of the Central Committee, the Propaganda and Agitation Department. The aim of my paper is to follow both the activity of the Propaganda and Agitation Department during the Stalinist period, 1948-1953, and the changes within the arts unions and other cultural institutions, using preeminently archival materials issued by this department, documents which were recently declassified. In the end, I will try to understand the weakness of the intellectuals and their coming to terms with the regime. The organization and functioning of the propaganda and agitation department produced both the perversion of the discourse regarding the arts and the harassment of the more or less refractory intellectuals. One of the main goals of the department's activity was the suppression of the cultural diversity, and therefore the cadre of the agitprop were determined to fight any spontaneous intellectual movement, showing dreary contempt for the artistic freedom. The so-called guidance of the arts was in fact a synonym for political censorship. In contrast with other Soviet-controlled countries in Central and Eastern Europe, like East Germany, where the agitprop networks succeeded in gaining grounds and influence working class and even intellectual urban milieus, as Richard Bodek pointed out in his study about everyday life in interwar era Berlin. In Romania, the communists had to defeat a much more reluctant attitude towards cooperation with the regime, at least in 1945. However, by the end of 1948, the Department of Propaganda and Agitation apparently succeeded to bear down the intellectuals' resistance, hesitation, and unwillingness to get involved. Between 1945 and 1948, within Romanian Communist Party, RCP, the central section of political education, agitprop's predecessor, bear the responsibility for propaganda and agitation activities, but it was a less coherent and consistent organization, determined also by the fact that RCP did not control all the government departments. Many local party organizations simply did not form agitprop departments due to the lack of qualified activists. The same situation confronted the Yugoslav communists immediately after 1944. And this low degree of organization could be compared with the same department of the Soviet Bolshevik Communist Party in the first years after October 1917, as described by Sheila Fitzpatrick. However, the Central Section of Political Education, SCEP, has a network of regional sections widespread in the Romanian counties and districts, and these political organizations gave consent to the publishing of new journals and magazines within their area of competence, thus doubling and overlapping the state's censorship, which functioned in direct subordination to the Ministry of Information. As far as one knows, each regional section has a commission which checked up and controlled all the activities regarding the local literature, the arts, included public representations and other performances. In some respects, the section cooperated with the secret police, and periodically the communist leadership convened conferences and meetings with the aim of training and disciplining from the ideological point of view the heads and the representatives of agitprop from all local units. Here, Iosif Chișinevski and Leon Târau, a Romanian Zhdanov, the two leaders of RCP's propaganda, defended the Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy. The section of political education, local units, had to fulfill many tasks. The control assignments delivered by the two heads of the propaganda to the delegates increased during 1947 preeminently after the Andrei Zhdanov's open declaration of the two-camp theory, his 1947 Cominform speech. Beginning with the autumn of 1947, the section for political education denounced more and more the so-called Western ideological offensive, a favorable opportunity to put communist militants in the country on guard and to stress that the section had to increase its functions and even to threaten with the suppression the local communist newspapers which had published inadequate articles, that is, materials with ideological errors. At the same time, the communist press yielded the orders to discredit Tudor Arghezi, the Romanian greatest poet alive, who was accused of decadence. Surely it is not a coincidence that the decisive attack took place at the beginning of January 1948 during the discussions regarding the reorganization of the Romanian Writers' Society. The Congress of the Pro-Communist Trade Union of Artists, Writers and Journalists organization pleaded for a sort of standardized art and literature which had to follow the Soviet socialist realism, now the only officially accepted method of artistic creation. Simultaneously, many non-communist and independent political and cultural magazines were closed down or undermined by the communist government. Thus, at the beginning of 1948, one can notice the disappearance of intellectual doubt and the uniformity of opinions in Romanian media. In fact, in Friedrich Hayek's terms, this is the end of truth in post-war Romania. Although the role of propaganda became overwhelming, the RCP needed the intellectuals as elements of its strategy of legitimacy. However, the Romanian writers and artists had to accept the communist terms and especially the so-called cultural guidance of the party. The ideological pressure during the first communist decade was exerted especially through the agency of Nicolae Moraru, an alleged specialist in aesthetics, in fact, an impostor, very poorly educated, who acted as a deputy of Leon Târau, the very top leader of the Romanian agitprop. After 1947, Nicolae Moraru closely watched the birth of a new artistic elite of painters, actors, and writers with so-called healthy social background. Nicolae Moraru also benefited from the use of the levers of control as a dignitary, as Secretary General of the Ministry of the Arts and Information, where he was appointed with the recommendation of the Propaganda and Agitation Department led by Leon Târau. In order to impose an efficient guidance of the Romanian culture, the Propaganda and Agitation Department became a sort of political tamer and determined both the reorganization and purge of the traditional artists and writers associations, which were transformed after the Soviet model in ideologically tamed creative unions, having subordinate leaderships with the role of disciplining the refractory intellectuals. The creative unions magazine and periodicals were controlled both by the union's structures and by the new state censorship, the General Department of Press and Prints, an institution which was, too, under the supervision of the Propaganda and Agitation Department. Some communists used to say that due to detailed personal files, the propagandists, instructors, and other party cadre of the PAD, Propaganda and Agitation Department, read the artists like a book. The department, through the agency of its different sectors, especially the sector for literature and arts, sometimes sent the orders and instructions directed to the low-level subordinate bodies or Ministry of Arts officials, neglecting and avoiding the government department's leadership, namely Eduard Mezincescu, who represented the more moderate cultural line within the party. Therefore, the Minister of Arts and Information, Mezincescu, complained about the insufficient communication and exchange of information to Leon Târau and Iosif Chișinevski, underlining the administrative abnormality. And I quote, "The way we keep in touch hinders the Ministry of Arts and Information to develop its own initiatives," end quote, concluded Mezincescu. And if one compare Eduard Mezincescu with Anatol Lunacharsky, his Soviet homologue in Russia after October 1917, one can notice the lack of authority of the Romanian Communist minister. The agitation and propaganda department became an important political actor, probably referring to Orwell's Ministry of Truth, but using the juridical terminology and taking into account the decision-making process on the cultural policy. Some scholars compared the Romanian agitprop with a sort of communist Supreme Court, but perhaps the comparison with an abusive general prosecution is more adequate. Also, the first attempt of comparing the ideological institutions continued with the leaderships of the creative unions, represented as similar with the law courts, lower judicial bodies. Besides the function of Supreme Court, which judged the refractory intellectuals and autocratically arbitrated the disputes between the artists and between the writers and publishing houses, the Department of Propaganda and Agitation received the task of selecting and distributing the cadre for the cultural and ideological institutions, such as Ministry of Arts and Information, later the Committee for Arts, after the Soviet model, Ministry of Education, Romanian Academy, the General Department of Press and Prints, creative unions, and so on. Another task was to give directives concerning the political and cultural newspapers, magazines, and radio, of course,